All right, Chapter 12, A Soggy Winter, November 7th, 1805 through March 23rd, 1806. The next day the explorers glimpsed land across the water. Puzzled, the men studied the horizon. How could they see land across the water if they were on the coast of the Pacific Ocean? Lewis stood up for a better look. "We haven't reached the coast," Lewis announced as he scanned the horizon. "We're still in the Columbia Estuary."
Estuary.
A passage where the tide meets a river current, especially an arm of the sea at the lower end of the river. The men's excitement faded. The estuary had become so wide and a pull of the tides had become so strong that the explorers had been fooled into thinking that they had reached the sea. But they had made a mistake. Discouraged, they continued paddling west. Each morning the men pushed off their canoes, eagerly expecting to reach the Pacific Ocean that day. The explorers could taste salt in the estuary water, and the salty taste grew stronger each day. After Seaman swam, his fur felt sticky and he smelled like a sea brine. When his fur dried, the white salt clung to the ends of the back of his fur like silvery tips of a grizzly bear fur. The skies became stormy and gusts of wind rocked the canoes. Sacagawea and several men became seasick. Nope, come on. Nope. No, move the page. Come on. There we go. The cloudy, windy weather continued, dampening the men's enthusiasm as well as their supplies, York remarked. "I thought the word Pacific meant calm, peaceful." Clark nodded. "It does." "Then whoever named this ocean must have been stupid. He needed to study the meaning of his words." Clark smiled. "Just look at this water," York said. "All the time crashing. We haven't even reached the open ocean, but the waves are already so big that they make me sick to my stomach. And it's so noisy. There's nothing peaceful about the Pacific Ocean." "I suppose the person who named this ocean was here in the summertime," Clark commented. "It's fall now. Seas always get stormy in the fall, even back east." "Well, maybe the Western Sea is Pacific in summertime, but right now it seems plain old nasty," York complained. "And I don't like the feel of it either. It rots away my clothes. Look at how my shirt is falling apart." York held up his arm to show the tattered sleeves of the buckskin shirt. The sea air seeped into the skin and all the fur as well as the clothing, so the explorers always felt damp and clammy. After he swam in the estuary, Seaman's fur was sticky. When it dried, the hair matted into stiff clumps. Sacagawea tried to untangle the dog's fur by combing it with a smooth stick, but the mats formed again as soon as Seaman went swimming. Once their canoes had entered the Columbia Estuary, the explorers rarely found a comfortable spot to camp. Often they had to huddle in a small cove with barely enough space for everybody to keep their toes dry. They slept on beds of pebbles. Gusts of chilly, damp wind blew against their faces, and pounding surf assaulted their ears. Fires were hard to start and even harder to keep going. The grounds smelled like decaying sea animals. On November 10th, the boats pulled into Point Ellis on the northern bank of the Columbia Estuary. The explorers thought that they had found a good campsite because of the high cliffs at the back of the beach would shelter them from some wind. But a storm at sea sent waves and high winds to batter the shore. The waves were so strong that the explorers could not get their boats back out. Point Ellis became a prison. It rained for 11 days. High tide was a horror. The waves drove gigantic uprooted trees crashing into camp. Captain Clark described their misery in his journal. "The wind increased to a storm, throwing the water over of the river with immense waves out of its banks, almost overwhelming us. Oh, how horrible this is the day." One afternoon, while the explorers were stranded at Point Ellis, Seaman stood at the edge of the water and began to bark. The men spotted a dark shape blobbing up, then vanishing behind the waves. The shape gradually came nearer, and they could see it was a boat. Indians were rowing out to the stranded explorers. They were Clatsops, relatives of the Chinooks. The short, half-naked Indians pulled their canoe to Point Ellis Beach and unloaded baskets of roots and fish. The captains and seamen gathered around the canoe. Gratefully, the explorers purchased the Clatsop's food. If the Clatsops could get in and out of Point Ellis during the stormy weather, perhaps some of the stronger men could manage to get out. On November 13th, the captains sent off Coulter, Shannon, and another man in the expedition's Indian canoe. The next day, Seaman ran to the rocks at the back of the beach, barking excitedly. He scrambled up the rocks and tunneled into the thick underbrush. A few minutes later, he trotted into the backside of John Coulter. He trotted back beside John Coulter. "We found a sandy beach on the bay," Coulter reported. "There's some game over there, too." Everybody was relieved. As soon as they could, the explorers moved to a more comfortable campsite. This is driving me crazy. There we go. The captains were hoping to meet a seagoing ship as they neared the coast. Before the expedition started, President Jefferson had given Captain Lewis a letter so that the corps could purchase goods on credit. If explorers could find a seagoing ship from the United States, they would be able to restock their supplies before their return trip. But the nearer the expedition got to the ocean, the more difficult travel became because the tides and stormy weather. Instead of taking the whole expedition to the coast, the captains decided to send small scouting parties to search for seagoing vessels. The rest of the corps camped along the estuary. The scouting parties went up to the Pacific coast for several miles. They visited Indian villages along the coast, but none of the local Indians could offer any information about a ship docked in the area. "My guess is we arrived too late to catch any seagoing vessels," Clark reported, after he returned from a scouting trip on the foot along the coast. "It's November, and the stormy season has certainly started here. Most seagoing ships leave by October." Lewis nodded. "We'd better start building our fort. We can't camp in this miserable rain all winter." The captains discussed the location for their winter fort. They needed a spot with fresh water for drinking, timber for building, and enough game for food. The local Indians reported that elk were more plentiful south of the Columbia estuary. But perhaps the corps should make a camp along the seacoast in the hope a ship might come by. Then again, the coastal climate was so wet that it might be better to travel back up the Columbia River and build a fort near the Nez Perce or their relatives. That would also give the corps a head start on their homeward journey. The captains called the entire group together. Seamen lay between the captains as they spoke. Sorry, y'all. "We're going to take a vote on where to build our winter camp," Lewis announced. Looking at each of the explorers, "There are good reasons for each course of action. If we camp close to the sea, we might meet up with a ship from our country and we'll be able to restock the trade goods from our return voyage, but it's wet and stormy by the coast." As Lewis spoke, Seaman held his head, watching Lewis's cheeks were pink from the damp wind and his hair whipped around his face. Some of the explorers held their hands in front of their eyes to protect them from the blowing sand. Sacagawea draped her blanket across over the head of her shoulders so Pomp would stay warm and dry in his cradleboard on her back. "We also can build our winter quarters inland," Clark said. "That will put us under shelter of the trees. If we build in the woods north of the estuary, the Chinook Indians will be our neighbors. If we choose the south side of the Columbia, we'll live near the Clatsops. Both groups are peaceful and eager to trade with us." Seaman felt a tickle on his side and a scratch at a flea with his hind paw. He looked at the human explorers as they listened to the captains. Most of them were also scratching their hair or rubbing their tattered clothes against their itchy skin. Seaman chewed the fur on one of his legs, trying to bite off another pesky flea. "It might be best to head back up the Columbia River and spend the winter near the Nez Perce Nation," Clark was saying. "They have our horses, and they welcomed us with great kindness across the Rockies." "We want everyone in the corps to have a voice in this decision," Lewis said. "Let's talk about the advantages of each location." Every adult in the group was included in the decision, even York and Sacagawea. This was remarkable, for in 1805 black men like York were not allowed to vote in the United States elections, nor were Indians or women like Sacagawea. After some discussion and a show of hands, the group voted to build their fort inland on the southern side of the Columbia estuary. On November 26, the explorers got back to their canoes and paddled south. Lewis took Seaman and 4 men to search for a suitable spot. When his group returned, Lewis announced, "We found a place for our fort, William. It's near a spring with fresh drinking water, and there are lots of trees and plenty of game. The men killed 6 elk and 5 deer in the area." Is it far from the ocean?" Clark asked. "We should send up an operation to boil seawater so we'll have a supply of salt." "Not far, just a few miles from the coast," Lewis answered. "There's a river near the spot, but the fort will be on a bluff, so we shouldn't be in danger of flooding." "Sounds good to me," Clark said. He leaned over to stroke the matted fur from under Seaman's ears. "You ready to move into a fort so we can get out of this rain, Seaman?" "I know I am." The Corps of Discovery began building Fort Clatsop on December 8th. During construction, it rained almost every day. The men felled trees and stripped their branches off of their trunks. They pushed the trunks into a soft earth to form the fort's outer walls. Seaman helped the men carry branches and brush from the edge of the clearing. He dragged the branches in his mouth and made a game of working by racing the men to the brush piles. Water steamed off the men's faces as they worked, and Seaman's coat dripped. He shook off every few minutes, but nobody shooed him away because everything was already wet. "Again the rain," muttered Charbonneau one day. "I think more water falls on Fort Clatsop than fills the whole Pacific Ocean." Shannon grinned. "Cheer up, man. We struggled for a year and a half to reach this place. We'd better make the best of it now that we're finally here." On December 23rd, the captains carried their bedrolls into their unfinished quarters. Seaman padded around the new building, sniffing the fresh pine floors, rough writing tables, and long walls. Lewis unrolled his blankets, and Seaman stretched out beside him. It was going to be home for the winter. The next day, the men finished covering most of their buildings inside Fort Clatsop's walls. They carried their gear into the new dry sleeping quarters. At dawn on December 25th, Seaman scrambled to his feet. The men were gathered outside the captain's hut. They fired a volley, shouted, and sang to announce Christmas Day, 1805. Lewis rolled over and hid his face with his arm, but Seaman tugged at his covers until Lewis hoisted himself up on an elbow. "Merry Christmas, Seaman," Lewis said, laughing. Clark rolled out of the damp sleeping roll and sat up. "Good morning, Merryweather," he shouted to the men outside. "Here we are at Fort Clatsop, men. The Corps of Discovery has reached the Pacific Ocean. Now that's a fine Christmas present." Seaman swabbed Clark's face with his tongue and then dragged the rest of the covers off Lewis. The captains were much too slow moving this morning, so Seaman ran out the open doorway to join the carolers. The group feasted on good wishes. There wasn't much else. It was a holiday for hunters as well as builders, and the damp climate, meat and fish, went rotten quickly. So the menu for Christmas dinner was spoiled elk meat, rotting fish, and a few sake roots. The meat and the fish smelled so bad that the men had to force themselves to put the food into their mouths. Seaman was not as fussy as the human explorers. He was the only member of the corps who ate with an appetite. After Christmas Day, the men completed work on the smokehouse and to try and preserve their meat. Fort Clatsop was finished in time for the new year. January 1st, 1806 was damp and drizzly. The explorers hardly celebrated New Year's Day at all, but at least the fort was finished, so they had dry wood floors to sleep on and a roof to keep the constant rain off of them. As soon as the explorers moved into their new quarters, so did the fleas. Ooh. Let's stop here, y'all. The video is about to finish, so I'll catch you on the next video, okay?